Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to installment 1 of Unit 7. I have my AP shirt on right here. Every year when I go to the AP grading, they make a shirt, and I buy one because it's always very comfy, and on the back of it, they put one of the documents for the DBQ. And I think to myself, I could be standing in a Starbucks or somewhere ordering, and the person behind me gets a little bit of historical education while I stand there ordering my grande mocha frappe latte light with chai. Oh my god. So it's really just a service to the people. That's what I'm about. De la gente. That's us. Okay. We're going to break out the Hulk Fist this time again. There's the Hulk Fist. In last unit, the Hulk Fist represented America's power and the flexing of American might. That's what's going to happen in this video. We're going to talk about World War I, where we get involved right at the end of the war and bring the muscle. Okay, that's the Hulk face. Okay, starting at the top of the study guide, ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about why we aren't in the war initially, right? We've been talking about imperialism for a while, and everyone would think that following our brief little jaunt in the Spanish-American War and then following big stick diplomacy, wouldn't we want to be involved with this war? It is the biggest event going. We should be there, right? We're a cool kid. We should be at the cool kids table. But we're not. President Wilson wants the nation neutral in mind and in thought and in deed. And one of the big parts of that is that Wilson wants to make sure that Americans are not getting involved for reasons that aren't pure. So let's talk about why we aren't there. Exceptionalism. Wilson points out the fact that we aren't like a lot of European powers. We don't have long dynastic feuds and alliances and monarchies and things. We're different from that. And in a way, we're above it. We don't have to get involved in petty squabbles. Immigrants and the fact that America has so many different types of immigrants that it's going to be very difficult for us to pick a side. Should we side with the English? Should we side with the Germans? Should we push for the French or the Russians? No matter where we talk about, there are enough Americans in America that we're going to offend by getting into war against their former home country. What if we have to recruit an army and we send a kid out to fight in the war basically against people from his own area? That could get really ugly. Neutrality in shipping. In a war, if you're not on either side, you're free to trade with both sides, and that's what we're doing. We are just Benjamining it. That's what we're about. Now, we're not doing nearly as much trade with the Allied powers as we are with the Entente powers. The French and the English are closer, and they also seem to be a little bit closer to our hearts. Aw, heart. Okay? They're just a little bit more friendly to the United States in their vision and in their way of doing things. And that means that our business with the English and the French is going to be much, much more committed than it is to the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians. What that also means is that the United States is going to just rack up this enormous amount of sales to them and loans over time. My phone keeps slipping, so I keep on having to adjust it. Sit still there, son. Sorry about that, folks. Come on. Okay. If you ask most people why we get involved with the war, they tell you the Lusitania. Now, that's not exactly true, because the Lusitania sank in 1915. We didn't get into the war until 1917, but the overall reasoning there is true. What gets us into the war? Events like the Lusitania. The sinking of ships that American lives are lost in, or American ships themselves. When the Lusitania goes down, a lot of Americans are screaming for an American entry into the war, and Wilson's taken a lot of heat on this one. But he believes that America can still stay out of the war. Eventually, the Germans realize, though, that if they don't sink every American vessel that crosses the Atlantic Ocean, they can't win. The English and the French are able to win not because they have superior manpower or a superior technology, they simply have a better Costco. The German Costco is shut. It's not there anymore. They don't have the supplies. America is the Costco for the English and the French. We have all the goods. We have those croissants that are really good, and like the 64-pack of fruit roll-ups. Oh, so good. And then, like the little muffins, they have those too. I'm not trying to make light of the incident. The fact being that we gave the British and the French enough supplies to fight the war. The Germans didn't have it. When the Germans finally decide to declare submarine warfare again, what they're really saying is, unless we do this, we can't win. Now, we might lose anyway, having started a war against America, and the Zimmermann telegram, the attempted alliance with the Germans, is one way that they might try and squeak out a win or something that resembles a win. But the Germans realize that if they don't try and stop American shipping, they're going to lose the war anyway. The war isn't so much being fought on the battlefield as it's being fought in the stomachs of the civilians and the soldiers of both sides of the battle. And we're winning the war for the Allies there. When Wilson eventually does take us into the war, we go in to make the world safe for democracy. Not for territorial conquest, not to try and swoop up part of France or a piece of Germany or the German Imperial Empire in the Pacific. No, no. We are there for the right reasons. We are here to try and make sure that the society is going to be American through and through. The whole world should have an American-based democratic system. Moving down the page here, some of the things we did on the home front. We're going to switch to the home front now. Okay, so the Hulk fist is kind of going away. Okay? On the home front, we did a number of things to fight the war. The huge trend of this whole unit, I said this to begin with, is the growing United States bureaucracy. That we are building up this bureaucracy over time to try and make sure that slowly but surely we fight this war as efficiently as possible. Selective Service Act really drafted soldiers for the war, and unlike the Civil War where there were massive riots and problems, there really isn't a huge problem here. It's a national system, but the states were free to draft locally as they wanted to. How did we pay for the war? We got people to buy Liberty bonds using catchy propaganda like "Help us crush the Kaiser." Okay? And we also increased income taxes. So most of the war is going to be paid off using those two methods. America doesn't want to get into a huge, steep loan crisis. We don't want to start printing money like we did in the Revolutionary War or like the South did during the Civil War, because when you start printing money, bad things happen. Okay? Going down into my little chart here, the WIB, the War Industries Board, is in charge of coordinating production and setting prices and maximizing efficiency. We've been working on antitrust legislation since the Roosevelt administration, right? Teddy trust busted, I beg your pardon. Taft did some, Wilson did some. Now we're going to let the trust go. Do everything you can do, be as powerful as you can, be as organized as you can, I beg your pardon, be efficient. And that means if we have to have trusts, we have to have them. Flip the page. You should too. Food Administration. I just love talking about this. I think this is just cool. Okay, led by Herbert Hoover, who's going to be quite a splash as a president later on. The Food Administration's goal was to make sure that we didn't run out of food and that we could supply as much as possible for people in other parts of the world. Now, Hoover pushed a voluntarism. We are not going to require you to eat a certain amount. We're not going to ration you as we are going to do during World War II. But what we are going to do is give you friendly tips on how to avoid eating meat products and maybe how to use cottage cheese in your recipes and how to practice a really nice Meatless Tuesday, okay, or a Porkless Thursday. Yeah, good times. The National War Labor Board is in charge of making sure that there are workers out there. So this is a coalition of the government, the owners, and the workers sitting down and saying, how do we make sure there's no strikes? And the easy way to make sure that there's no strikes is you give the workers whatever they want. The higher wages, the lower hours, the better conditions that they've been pushing for decades, and they get those things. Now, very briefly, they get them during the war. Keep in mind, these things are going to go away after the war, and when they do go away, it's going to be ugly. The CPI, the Committee for Public Information, was in charge of running the image and the message of the war. We want every American on the right page. We don't want you to go next door and kill your neighbor because he's a German, but we certainly want you to think that America and the British and the French are a more noble cause than the German and Austro-Hungarian cause, because America, that's why. Briefly discuss the effect of the war on women. Women, by working towards the overall war cause, are able to gain the vote. So by the 19th Amendment, shortly after World War I, women gained the right to vote in national elections. Power. African Americans, this is a big one. African Americans move out of the South in huge numbers during what's called the Great Migration, and they move up to northern industrial cities to help meet the demand for industrial production. That brings about the first real confluence of northern white populations with African American populations coming out of the South. And we would hope that that would go well, but it doesn't really go well, especially right after the war, when there's stiff competition for jobs, with returning veterans coming home and African Americans arriving, hoping to get those jobs, but also for housing as well. There's going to be a number of riots. It's not going to be pretty. Prohibition. Why did we ban alcohol? Well, we're kind of on a moral kick. And alcohol certainly doesn't fit well if we're on a moral kick. But there's other reasons as well. We're trying to conserve grain products, and no sense making whiskey and beer when we can make bread. We are also trying to be anti-German, and everyone associates the beer as being kind of a German phenomenon, even though there are other groups that seem to be pretty good at drinking it too. Seems like a fine line there, folks. But really the heart of this is that the progressive movement has been pushing for this moral reform here for a number of years. A dozen plus states had already banned alcohol before the war. It seemed like the time was right. Now this turns out to be a complete flop, as we know, right? Prohibition's a huge failure. But the national mood was that we wanted people to stop drinking alcohol. I adjusted the phone again. There we are. Espionage and Sedition Acts. We want to protect the country from anyone who might try and limit the war effort. And so the Espionage and Sedition Acts are set up in order to do that. The most visible offender, the person who gets the most press for this, is Charles Schenck. Schenk's the secretary of the American Socialist Party, and he distributes these leaflets to men who have been drafted saying basically the war's just this capitalist scam. All they want you for is a body bag. You're going over there to serve the man and the system and the evil empire. Just another case of the man keeping us down. That's what it was. But Schenck passed out these leaflets claiming that it was part of his free speech, that he had a right to say what he wanted to say. The Supreme Court's ruling disagreed with Schenck and basically pointed out a key doctrine that comes into play in First Amendment rights down the road here, and that's the clear and present danger doctrine, that the conditions really dictate whether or not Schenck has a right to say what he wants to say. If what Schenck is saying poses a clear and present danger to the United States and its security, then the Congress has the responsibility and the right to limit that speech. So, Mr. Schenck, you are headed to jail. But that clear and present danger portion, that's the main one. Let's finish this up with the Treaty of Versailles. When the war ended, the Germans thought and hoped that they were going to get a war that ended with the terms of Wilson's 14 points. Wilson had constructed this enormous plan that was set to make sure that there would never be war again in the world. Okay, the League of Nations was the centerpiece of it, and there were also other parts like free trade and freedom of the seas and no secret treaties and self-determination. But Wilson believed that as long as those points carried through, there would be a peaceful world. The Germans liked the idea. Now, unfortunately, the Germans aren't going to get that, right? Because the French and the British show up looking for blood. They've been fighting this war a lot longer, and although the Americans have been very generous with their time and with their money and with their soldiers in the last year, they certainly haven't been bearing the burden in the same way that the British and the French have, and so the British and the French want their pound of flesh. When Wilson comes back to America with the Treaty of Versailles in hand and lays it before the American people, he expects things to go pretty well, and he's wrong on this one. The members of the Senate, who really have the right to decide whether or not the United States will sign a treaty, refuse to sign the treaty for a number of reasons. The main one is the collective security clause of the treaty, what's called Article X. Article X requires that the United States join the League of Nations, and if there's a need for American military force, we could be drawn into that military action whether we wanted to or not. Members of the Congress, who traditionally and constitutionally have the right to